Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the strange and drowsy corners of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that blur the line between lullaby and lore. Now, settle in for Chapter 1. A forgotten mask, where a plague doctor's absent-mindedness spirals into a night of absurdity and dread. The evening had begun like any other in the plague-riddled city of Varen's Hollow. Lanterns flickered weakly against the fog. Distant cries of the sick echoed through the winding streets, and the air carried the heavy perfume of vinegar and decay. Dr. Elias Mortimer, the town's sole plague doctor, had always prided himself on his punctuality. His routine was sacred. Don the mask, fill the beak with herbs, adjust the wide-brimmed hat, and step into the night to tend to the dying. But tonight of all nights he had forgotten the mask. He realized it the moment his gloved hand touched the doorknob of his cottage. His face felt strangely light, unburdened. He patted his chest, his belt, even his pockets, as if the mask might have shrunk and hidden itself in some improbable crevice. But no. The mask, his great, curved beak of stained leather, the glass eyes that made him look like some ghastly bird of prey, was still perched on the dresser upstairs, right beside the half-empty bottle of lavender oil had meant to refill. Elias groaned. The sick house was a 20-minute walk through the most infected district of the city, and without the mask, he was just another man. A man who, by all accounts, should be dead or dying. The citizens of Varen's Hollow had grown accustomed to the plague doctor's silhouette, a harbinger of death, yes, but a sanctioned one. Without it, he was merely a fool wandering the miasma. He considered turning back. The sick could wait. But then he thought of the baker's daughter, the one with the fever that made her speak in tongues, and the old carpenter who had begged him yesterday to ease his pain. Elias exhaled sharply, straightened his coat, and stepped into the street. He would have to move quickly and hope no one looked too closely. The first hurdle was the night watch. Old man Darrow, who had lost an eye to the pox years ago, leaned against his halberd at the corner of Willow Lane. His good eye narrowed as Elias approached. "You're out late," Darrow wheezed. "No mask tonight, Doctor?" Elias forced a chuckle. "Ah, well, ran out of wormwood. Had to make do with a lighter scent tonight. Can't weigh down the old beak, you know." He patted his bare face as if this explanation made any sense at all. Darrow squinted, but the plague doctor's voice was unmistakable. Dry and rasping, like pages turning in a dusty book. "Strange times," the watchman muttered, waving him on. The streets grew narrower, the air thicker. Elias kept his head down, avoiding the hollow-eyed stares of those still well enough to linger in doorways. Without the mask, he felt naked. The mask was more than protection. It was authority. It transformed the act of pressing a lancet to a swollen bubo into something clinical, even holy. Without it, he was just a man with a knife. Then came the crows. They perched on the eaves of the sick house, their beady eyes tracking him as he approached. Crows always gathered where death was near, but tonight they seemed especially bold. One swooped low, its wing brushing Elias's hat. He swatted at it, heart pounding. Was this an omen? Or were they merely confused by the absence of his beak? The sick house door creaked open before he could knock. Sister Marguerite, her wimples stained with sweat and worse, blinked at him. "Doctor, where's your—" "Experimental treatment," Elias interrupted. "The mask interferes. Now, how is the baker's girl?" Marguerite hesitated, but let him in. The sick house was a chorus of moans and whispers. The air was thick with the scent of rotting flowers and burnt hair, the usual attempts to ward off miasma. Elias moved through the rows of cots, trying to ignore the way the patients recoiled when they saw his face. He was used to fear, but not this kind. Not the fear of a man, but of a stranger. Halfway through his rounds, it happened. The carpenter, old Thomas, sat bolt upright and pointed a trembling finger. "You," he hissed. "You're not the doctor. The doctor has a face like the Reaper. You're a thief, a grave robber." The room erupted. Patients who moments ago had been too weak to lift their heads now shrieked, clutching their blankets like shields. Sister Marguerite grabbed Elias's arm. "What is this?" Panic clawed at his throat. He could explain, but explanations required trust, and trust required the mask. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a handful of dried lavender, and crushed it to his face. "Zay!" he shouted, his voice muffled by the herbs. Still the doctor, just new method. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, Thomas lay back down. "Strange times," he murmured, echoing Darrow. Elias finished his rounds in record time. As he stepped back into the night, he realized two things. First, that he had somehow managed not to be lynched by a mob of delirious plague victims, and second, that the crows were still watching him. One let out a croak that sounded suspiciously like laughter. He walked home faster than usual. Tomorrow he would not forget the mask. But for now, the night was not done with him. Somewhere in the fog, a bell tolled, not the steady rhythm of the curfew, but the frantic clang of the quarantine alarm. Elias froze. That meant only one thing, a new outbreak. And without his mask, he was just another potential corpse. The crows took flight, their wings beating like a slow, mocking applause. Chapter 2. The Village of Perpetual Sickness. The quarantine bell still rang in Elias's ears as he trudged through the muck toward the outskirts of Varen's Hollow. The fog here was thicker, clinging to the trees like damp wool, and the smell, oh, the smell, was something between overripe cheese and a butcher's floor after a week in the sun. The village of Black Reek lay ahead, a place so perpetually ill that its inhabitants had long stopped bothering with funerals. They just propped the dead up in chairs at the tavern until someone remembered to toss them in the pit. Elias had been summoned by a boy with a crooked nose and a cough that sounded like a door hinge in need of oil. "They say you're the doctor," the boy had wheezed, thrusting a note into his hand. The ink was smudged, but the message was clear. "Come quick. We've got a new one. I've been on the hand. It got sick." Now, as he approached the first hovel, he could hear the villagers before he saw them. A chorus of sniffles, groans, and the occasional wet, hacking cough filled the air like some dismal orchestra tuning its instruments. A woman leaned out of an upper window, her face a mosaic of pustules, and dumped a bucket of something foul into the street. It splashed near Elias's boots. She didn't apologize. The village square was a sight to behold. A group of children played Plague and Pestilence, a local game that involved chasing each other with sticks while pretending to collapse dramatically. An old man sat on a bench, methodically lancing his own boils and flicking the contents into the dirt. A merchant had set up a stall selling miraculous anti-death elixirs, which smelled suspiciously like watered-down vinegar with a hint of regret. Elias adjusted his mask, he hadn't forgotten it this time, and stepped forward. "Where's the patient?" A toothless woman pointed toward the inn. "Third floor. The one with the green door, or maybe the blue, or the one with the holes. Honestly, they all look the same after the fever takes hold." The inn was worse inside than out. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the walls were stained with things Elias didn't care to identify. He climbed the stairs, each step releasing a puff of dust that made his nose itch beneath the mask. The third-floor hallway was lined with doors, each slightly ajar, each emitting its own unique symphony of misery. One room featured a man singing a ballad to his own swollen leg. Another had a woman arguing with a hallucination of her deceased mother about turnip prices. He found the green, or possibly blue, door and pushed it open. Inside, a figure lay sprawled on the bed, wrapped in so many blankets they resembled a poorly stuffed sausage. The patient lifted their head, revealing a face so flushed it was nearly purple. "Ah," croaked the patient. "The birdman cometh." Elias sighed. "Yes, the birdman cometh. What seems to be the problem?" The patient, a wiry man with eyebrows like overgrown hedges, gestured grandly at himself. "Where to begin? The sweating, the shaking, the visions of my grandmother riding a giant frog into battle. Also, I think my toes are plotting against me." Elias pinched the bridge of his beak. "Right. Let's start with the fever." As he examined the man, the door creaked open, and a small crowd of villagers shuffled in, clutching their various ailments like prized possessions. A woman held out a swollen finger. "Since you're here, could you take a look at this?" A man lifted his shirt to reveal a rash that spelled out what appeared to be the word "help" in raised red bumps. Elias held up a hand. "One at a time, and preferably not in the dying man's bedroom." The villagers ignored him. Soon the room was packed with bodies, all clamoring for his attention. Someone shoved a cup of something warm into his hands. "Drink this, it's good for the humors." Elias eyed the murky liquid. "What's in it?" "Mostly moss, some egg. A bit of that powder the alchemist left behind before he, expired." Elias set the cup down very carefully. Somehow, hours later, he had lanced, bandaged, and prescribed his way through the entire village. The sun was setting, casting the square in a sickly orange glow. The children had moved on from plague and pestilence to a new game called Bury the Apothecary, which involved a lot of dramatic moaning and one very patient dog playing the role of the corpse. As Elias packed his supplies, the village elder hobbled over. He was a shriveled thing, hunched like a question mark, with a voice like gravel in a tin cup. "You'll be back next week?" Elias hesitated. "Do you expect a sudden improvement in your collective health?" The elder chuckled, which turned into a cough, which turned into a fit so violent Elias had to steady him. When he recovered, he wiped his mouth and grinned. "Nah, but it's nice to have fresh blood around, metaphorically speaking." Elias left Black Creek as the first stars appeared, the villagers waving cheerfully from their doorways. The road back to Varen's Hollow was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. Then, from the darkness, a voice called out, "Doctor!" Elias turned. A figure lurched toward him, clutching their stomach. I think I've got it." Elias closed his eyes for a brief, weary moment. Then he reached for his lancet. Some nights never ended, and somewhere the crows watched, waiting for their turn. Chapter 3. The Mayor's Desperate Plea. Elias had barely stepped foot back into Varen's Hollow when the commotion began. A cluster of townsfolk huddled near the well, their whispers rising like smoke into the twilight air. He adjusted his mask, securely fastened this time, and approached. The crowd parted before him, revealing a sight that made even his plague-hardened stomach lurch. Mayor Thaddeus Winthrop III lay sprawled across the cobblestones, his fine velvet coat stained with sweat and something vaguely greenish. His face was the color of spoiled milk, his lips cracked and trembling. One hand clutched his belly as though trying to keep his insides from spilling out, while the other flapped weakly in Elias' direction. "Doctor," the mayor croaked. "Thank the wretched heavens." Elias crouched beside him. "What happened?" The mayor's eyes rolled like marbles in a cup. "Ate the pudding." A woman in the crowd leaned in. "The special pudding." Elias didn't like the way she said, "especial." "Who made this pudding?" The townsfolk exchanged glances. Finally a boy piped up. "Old Nan." She said it was her revitalizing recipe. Elias pinched the bridge of his beak. Old Nan's revitalizing recipes were infamous. The last one had allegedly contained crushed beetles, fermented cabbage, and what she insisted was just a pinch of mummy powder. No one had asked where she got the mummy. The mayor seized Elias's sleeve. "You must help me. I feel. His mouth worked silently for a moment before he finished. I feel like a man who has eaten pudding that should not have been eaten. Elias sighed. Can you stand? The mayor attempted to rise, wobbled like a newborn deer, and collapsed back onto the stones. No doshiri. With the help of two burly farmers, Elias hauled the mayor to his feet, and half-dragged, half-carried him toward his manor. The grand Winthrop residence loomed ahead, its once proud facade now sagging under layers of ivy and neglect. The front door creaked open to reveal a harried-looking butler who took one look at his employer and sighed. Again, sir? The mayor groaned in response. The butler stepped aside, ushering them into a dimly lit parlor, where the air smelled of damp upholstery and regret. They deposited the mayor onto a chaise longue, which emitted a sound like a dying accordion under his weight. Elias peeled off his gloves and began his examination. The mayor's pulse was erratic, his skin feverish. His breath smelled like something had crawled into his mouth and died. Elias pressed a hand to the man's abdomen, and the mayor let out a shriek that startled a family of pigeons from the chimney. Definitely the pudding, Elias muttered. The mayor grabbed his wrist. You must save me, doctor. I have, important business, meetings, proclamations, proclamating. His words slurred together like a drunkard song. Elias glanced at the butler. What kind of meetings? The butler's expression was drear than the herbs in Elias' mask. Mostly him yelling at clouds and declaring war on the neighboring villages' turnip exports. The mayor waved a feeble hand. Those turnips are, i.e. threatening. Elias ignored this and turned back to his patient. You need rest, and possibly a priest. The mayor's eyes widened. No priests. Last time one tried to exorcise my cat. Elias couldn't blame the priest. That cat was definitely possessed. He rummaged in his satchel for a tincture of willow bark and mint, something to calm the mayor's stomach and lower his fever. As he measured the dose, the mayor's gaze fixed on his face, or rather where his face would be, if not for the mask. Why do you wear that thing? The mayor slurred. Elias paused. Protection. The mayor squinted. From what? Personality? Elias considered dumping the tincture on the man's head. Instead, he held out the cup. Drink, Barty. The mayor obeyed, then immediately made a face like he'd swallowed a live eel. This tastes like disappointment. That's the mint, Elias said. The mayor's head lolled back against the chaise. Doctor, what if I die? Elias snapped his satchel shut. Then I suppose the turnips win. The mayor let out a noise that might have been a sob or a hiccup. Possibly both. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. The butler lit a candle, its feeble glow doing little to dispel the gloom. Elias was halfway to the door when the mayor called out again. Wait, what if I pay you extra? Elias turned. How much extra? The mayor fumbled for a coin purse at his belt and upended it onto the floor. A handful of tarnished pennies and a button rolled out. Elias stared at them, then at the mayor, then at the butler, who shrugged as if to say, we don't get many visitors these days. Shia. Keep your button, Elias said, and left. The night air was a relief after the stifling manor. He walked slowly, letting the cool breeze seep through his coat. The streets were quiet now, save for the occasional cough from an open window or the skitter of rats in the gutters. He was nearly home when he heard it, a soft, wet sound, like a spoon sinking into overripe fruit. He turned. The mayor stood in the middle of the road, swaying like a sapling in a storm. His face had taken on a distinctly greenish hue. Doctor, he gasped. I think the pudding is... Elias didn't wait to hear the rest. He took off at a brisk pace, the mayor's retching echoing behind him. Some things, once seen, could never be unseen, and as he rounded the corner, he swore he heard the faint, mocking yoe-caw of a crow. Chapter 4. A substitute of questionable efficacy. Elias awoke to the sound of something small and determined scratching at his door. The morning light seeped through the cracks in his shutters, painting stripes of gold across the floorboards, still littered with empty bottles of dubious tinctures. He groaned, rolled onto his side, and immediately regretted it, as his head throbbed in protest. Last night's visit to the mayor had ended with a bottle of something old Nan had sworn was medicinal. It had tasted like despair and burned like regret. The scratching intensified. Elias stumbled to the door and yanked it open. A chicken stood on his doorstep, its beady eyes fixed on him with unsettling intensity. It was a scrawny thing, feathers patchy, one wing slightly askew as though it had recently lost an argument with a cartwheel. For a long moment, man and bird stared at each other. Then the chicken let out a squawk that sounded suspiciously like an accusation, and dropped a single wilted herb at his feet. Elias squinted. "Is that time?" The chicken did not answer. It pecked once at his boot, and strutted away, leaving him with the herb and a creeping sense of foreboding. He was still holding the time when the boy arrived. The same one with the crooked nose who had fetched him to Black Reek. The boy took one look at Elias, barefoot, rumpled, clutching a sprig of herbs, and said, "You look terrible." Elias rubbed his temples. "What do you want?" "They're saying the sickness is spreading faster," the boy said. Old Man Hob woke up this morning with spots that spell out his own name, and the blacksmith's wife swears her left arm is singing hymns in a language no one understands. Elias sighed. "Tell them I'll be there by noon." The boy nodded and scampered off. Elias closed the door and leaned against it, contemplating the sheer absurdity of his existence. Then he remembered the mask. Or rather, he remembered its absence. His proper beak mask, the one with the glass eyes and the carefully packed herbs, was still at the tanner's, being repaired after yesterday's unfortunate incident involving the mayor's cat and a misplaced lancet. He had no backup. The thought of facing the villagers barefisted sent a shudder through him. Without the mask, he was just a man. And men, in times of plague, were as disposable as yesterday's leeches. His gaze fell upon the chicken herb, then upon the empty pot on his table, then, slowly, upon the hatchet by the fireplace. An hour later, Elias stepped out of his cottage wearing what might charitably be called a mask. The chicken's hollowed-out skull sat snugly over his nose and mouth, its beak protruding like some grotesque parody of his usual apparatus. He'd lined the inside with the thyme and a handful of other questionable herbs from his stash, tied it all together with twine, and affixed it to his face using a combination of stubbornness and desperation. It smelled like poultry and poor decisions. The walk to the village square was longer than usual. People stopped to stare. Children pointed. A dog took one look at him and hid under a cart. Old man Darrow, the watchman, nearly dropped his halberd. "By all that's unholy, doctor, what is your thought?" Elias adjusted the chicken skull. "Innovation." Darrow opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I think I liked it better when you forgot your mask." The square was in chaos. A crowd had gathered around the well where Old Man Hob stood on a barrel, proudly displaying his name spelled out in raised, angry welts across his chest. The blacksmith's wife waved her singing arm like a conductor leading some unseen choir. And in the center of it all stood Sister Marguerite, her wimple askew, her expression caught between exhaustion and alarm. She spotted Elias and froze. "Oh." Elias ignored the stares and strode forward. Who's worst off? A farmer's wife thrust forward a toddler whose skin had taken on a peculiar shade of blue. Little Timmy ate something he shouldn't have. Elias peered at the child. What did he eat? The woman hesitated. "We think it was a candle." Elias closed his eyes for a brief, prayerful moment. Then he knelt, chicken mask wobbling, and pried the boy's mouth open. The smell of tallow and lavender wafted out. Definitely a candle. The treatments passed in a blur. Elias lanced boils, dispensed tinctures, and at one point attempted to reason with the blacksmith's arm, which was now harmonizing with itself. Through it all, the chicken mask grew increasingly unstable. The twine chafed, the thyme tickled, and the beak kept sagging to one side, giving him the appearance of a bird that had flown into a wall. By midday, the crowd had thinned, leaving only the truly desperate. A young girl tugged on Elias's sleeve. "Mr. Birdman," she whispered, "my granny says she's got a demon in her toe." Elias sighed. "Let me guess. It sings too?" The girl shook her head. No. It quotes scripture." Against his better judgment, Elias followed her to a cramped hut at the edge of the square. Inside, an ancient woman sat in a rocking chair, one bare foot propped on a stool. Her big toe was an angry purple, and as they entered, it emitted a noise that was unmistakably Latin. Elias stared. "That's new?" The old woman nodded sagely. "Book of Revelations, if I'm not mistaken." Elias pinched the bridge of his, the chicken's nose. "Right. Let's see what we're dealing with." He reached for his lancet just as the final strand of twine gave way. The chicken mask slid down his face, hung for a heart-stopping moment, then dropped onto the old woman's lap. Silence. The toe stopped quoting. The old woman blinked at the mask. Then at Elias. Then, slowly, she picked up the chicken skull and placed it gently on her own head. "Better?" she asked. Elias opened his mouth, closed it. Outside, the first notes of the quarantine bell began to toll. And somewhere, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a crow laughing. Chapter 5. The Apothecary's Dubious Remedies. The morning after the chicken mask incident, Elias woke to find his proper plague. Dr. Mask returned, neatly repaired, smelling faintly of lavender, and resting on his doorstep with all the solemnity of a sleeping cat. The tanner had even thoughtfully included a note, "Ike a tree not to lose it again, or let cats near it." Elias clutched the mask to his chest like a long-lost child, then immediately strapped it on, relishing the familiar weight of leather and herbs against his face. He would never again take for granted the simple dignity of not resembling poultry. His relief was short-lived. The village square had transformed overnight into something resembling a demented festival. Stalls had sprouted up between the usual filth and detritus, each manned by enterprising souls hawking their wares. A man in a feathered cap waved bottles of murky liquid at passers-by, shouting about dragon's blood elixir. Another had set up a table displaying what appeared to be pickled rats wearing tiny hats. And at the center of it all, perched atop a barrel like a self-appointed king of quackery, stood the apothecary, Master Aloysius Pindle. Pindle was a thin man, with a nose like a bent nail and eyebrows that seemed intent on devouring his forehead. His sleeves were perpetually rolled up to reveal arms, stained a worrying array of colors. And today he wore an apron that might once have been white, but now resembled an abstract painting titled Ardre and Beetroot. Elias approached just as Pindle was demonstrating his latest invention to a crowd of credulous villagers. "Behold!" Pindle brandished a jar containing something that writhed sluggishly. "The cure to all your ailments, brewed from the tears of a saint, the sweat of a virgin, and just a dash of arsenic for potency." A woman in the front row gasped. "Does it really contain saint's tears?" Pindle's grin widened. "Well, tears of someone who cried near a church once. Close enough for government work, eh?" Elias groaned behind his mask. Pindle spotted him and waved enthusiastically. "Ah, the good doctor. Come to witness medical history, have you?" Elias folded his arms. "I've come to witness something." Pindle either missed or ignored the sarcasm. He hopped down from the barrel and seized Elias's elbow, dragging him toward a table laden with bottles, jars, and one particularly ominous-looking sack. "You're just in time for the demonstration." Elias glanced at the sack. "What's in that?" Pindle winked. "Surprises." Before Elias could protest, Pindle clapped his hands, and the crowd leaned in expectantly. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I present to you the definitive solution to the plague." He reached into the sack and withdrew. Elias blinked. "Is that a toad?" "Not just any toad." Pindle held the creature aloft. It blinked its bulbous eyes with an air of resigned suffering. "This, my friends, is the famous Buffonidus medicinalis. Apply it to the afflicted area, and its mystical humors will draw out the corruption." A man in the crowd raised a hand. "How do you apply it?" Pindle beamed. "You strap it to the boil and leave it there until it explodes." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Elias wondered if it was too late to fake his own death. Pindle continued, undeterred by the doctor's silence. "But wait, that's not all." He produced another jar, this one filled with what looked like congealed gravy. "For internal complaints I present snail syrup, guaranteed to—" "Let me stop you there," Elias said, stepping forward. He plucked the jar from Pindle's hands and sniffed. His eyes watered instantly. "This is vinegar, and something furry." Pindle snatched the jar back. "It's vageling." Elias turned to the crowd. "Please, don't drink furry vinegar." A woman at the back shouted, "But what if I already did?" Elias hesitated. "How do you feel?" "Tingly." "That might just be the plague." Pindle scoffed. "You physicians are all the same, afraid of progress. Why, just yesterday I cured a man's gout by having him swallow a live goldfish." Elias stared. "Did it work?" "Well, he stopped complaining about the gout." "Because he died?" Pindle waved a hand. "Details, details." The crowd was beginning to look uncertain. Sensing this, Pindle made a show of rummaging through his supplies before pulling out his pièce de résistance, a vial of something that glowed faintly green. "For those who want healing results, behold, the elixir of eternal vigor." Elias eyed the glowing liquid. "What's in that one?" "A secret blend of moonlight, crushed emeralds, and other things." "Other things?" "Mostly other things." Elias reached for the vial. "Let me see." Pindle yanked it away. Trade secrets, but I can tell you this, one sip and you'll feel like a new man." "And how many sips until you carry a new man? As in, spiritually?" Pindle hesitated just a fraction too long. "That depends on your definition of man." At that moment, the mayor's butler pushed through the crowd, his face ashen. "Doctor, you must come at once. The mayor has—" Elias didn't wait to hear the rest. He pushed past Pindle, who was now attempting to sell a plague-repelling necklace made of what looked like dried onions, and followed the butler at a run. The mayor's manor was in chaos. Servants scurried about like startled mice, and the air smelled of burnt hair and panic. Upstairs, the mayor lay in his bed, his face now a shade of green that rivaled Pindle's elixir. His eyes rolled toward Elias. "Doctor," he croaked, "I took the apothecary's advice." Elias's stomach sank. "Which advice?" The mayor pointed weakly to the nightstand. There, next to an empty glass, sat a small handwritten note. IA4. Best results, combine with toad. In Pistes, 9 Condici. Elias closed his eyes. "Where's the toad?" A faint a-ribbiting came from under the bed. Somehow, the night stretched longer. Elias administered charcoal, forced the mayor to drink enough water to drown a small horse, and at one point considered just letting nature take its course. As dawn crept through the windows, the mayor finally slept, his breathing less labored, his skin slightly less reminiscent of moldy cheese. Elias slumped into a chair, his mask hanging loose around his neck. The butler appeared at his side, offering a cup of something that smelled suspiciously like Pindle's snail syrup. Elias declined. Outside, the first vendors were setting up their stalls again. He could hear Pindle's voice, already booming with renewed vigor, extolling the virtues of something called Mermaid's Breath Balm. Elias sighed. Somewhere, a crow laughed, and the plague went on. Chapter 6. The Dance of the Doomed. Elias had seen many peculiar things since the plague began. Men who swore their toes were whispering treason, women who coughed up what appeared to be tiny, perfectly formed turnips, and of course, the singing arm incident. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him when he pushed open the doors of the sick house that evening. The great hall, usually a grim tableau of groaning bodies and sweat-soaked cots, had transformed into something resembling a macabre ballroom. Patients swayed and twirled in the flickering torchlight, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, their faces flushed with fever. A man with buboes the size of walnuts waltzed with a broom. A woman wrapped in a burial shawl spun in slow circles, humming a tune that might have been a hymn or possibly a drinking song. Near the far wall, old Thomas, who had been at death's door just yesterday, was attempting a jig while his left leg stubbornly refused to cooperate, resulting in something that looked like a seizure with aspirations. Sister Marguerite stood by the door, clutching a bucket of leeches to her chest like a security blanket. Her eyes were wide, her wimple askew. "They started an hour ago," she whispered. One minute they were delirious but quiet, the next. She gestured helplessly at the scene. Elias adjusted his mask. "Has anyone tried to stop them?" "We did. Brother Anselm said it was sinful to dance during a plague. Then he joined in." She pointed to where the monk in question was attempting a handstand near the altar. Elias sighed. "Right, let's assess the damage." He moved through the crowd, dodging flailing limbs and the occasional flying shoe. The musicians, if they could be called that, consisted of 3 men with a tambourine, a badly tuned lute, and what appeared to be a cheese grater being scraped with a spoon. The resulting cacophony was less music, and more what one might hear if a cat fell into a sack of bells. A young woman with flowers braided into her hair, flowers that Elias was fairly certain were not actually there, seized his hands. "Dance with me, Birdman." Elias extricated himself gently. "I'm afraid I have 2 left feet." She looked down, confused. "No, you don't." "Metaphorically." She blinked, then wandered off to dance with a pillar. The mayor's wife, Lady Winthrop, swept past in a gown that had probably been very fine before someone vomited on it. She curtsied graciously to a pile of laundry, then announced to the room at large, "We must have a proper dance master. Someone to teach these poor souls the steps." Elias turned to Marguerite. "Please tell me we don't have a dance master." Marguerite winced. "We do now." A wiry man with a waxed mustache and an air of misplaced confidence stepped onto a bench and clapped his hands. "Attention, Miss Malades. I am Pierre Lefebvre, former dance instructor to the Duke of, well, it doesn't matter now, does it, former line." To Elias's horror, the patients obeyed. Pierre leapt down and began demonstrating what he called the pas de peste, a series of steps that involved a great deal of hopping, coughing into one's elbow, and, at one point, dramatically collapsing only to spring up again. The sick followed along with alarming enthusiasm. A man in the back fainted mid-leap, and was promptly propped up by his neighbors so as not to disrupt the formation. Elias rubbed his temples. "This is the worst thing I've ever seen." Marguerite nodded. "Brother Anselm says it's a miracle." "Brother Anselm is currently licking the floor." "Miracle adjacent, then." Pierre clapped his hands again. "Now, the grand finale. Partners, please." The patients scrambled to pair up. Lady Winthrop grabbed the broom again. Old Thomas seized a startled nun. And the baker's daughter, who had been quietly bleeding from the ears, took the hand of a man who was, as far as Elias could tell, already dead. Pierre raised his arms. Spin! The room erupted into motion. Bodies whirled, limbs flailed, and at least 3 people fell over immediately. A woman's wig went flying and landed in a bowl of soup. The dead man's arm detached at the elbow, but continued to be held aloft by the baker's daughter, who seemed not to have noticed. Elias turned to Marguerite. "We need to stop this before someone's lung ends up on the ceiling." She chewed her lip. "How?" He surveyed the chaos. Then his gaze landed on the musicians. Without hesitation he strode over, snatched the tambourine, and brought it down on the lute player's head with a satisfying crunch. The music died abruptly. The dancers staggered to a halt, blinking as though waking from a dream. Pierre, mid-pirouette, wobbled and sat down hard. "Mon Dieu," he muttered. What was in that soup? Silence fell. Then, one by one, the patients began to collapse, some gracefully, some like sacks of potatoes. Lady Winthrop curtsied to a stool and then slid gently beneath the table. The baker's daughter hugged the detached arm like a teddy bear and sighed into sleep. Elias exhaled. "That's better." Marguerite eyed the unconscious forms. "Do you think they'll remember any of this?" "I certainly won't." Outside, the moon hung heavy over the village, its light filtering through the stained glass of the sick-house windows and painting the scene in hues of blue and silver. The air smelled of sweat and herbs and the faint, lingering tang of madness. Elias stepped out into the cool night, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its voice hoarse with amusement. And far away, beneath the weight of dreams, the plague-ridden villagers danced on in their sleep, their fevered minds still spinning to the sound of phantom lutes. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Internal Monologue. Elias Mortimer had never intended to become a plague doctor. In his youth, he had dreamed of being a philosopher, or perhaps a moderately successful baker, professions that generally didn't involve prodding strangers' pustules or being vomited on by mares. Yet here he stood, mask securely fastened, staring down at yet another patient who seemed determined to complicate his existence. This one, a farmer named Jeb, had developed a condition that caused his skin to emit a faint blue glow. "It started last night," Jeb said, holding up his hands, which shimmered like a bad tavern sign. "Woke up and my wife screamed. Thought I was the Virgin Mary." Elias leaned in, examining the unnatural radiance. "Are you holy? I once won a pig at confession." "That's not the same thing." He pressed a finger to Jeb's forearm, half expecting some mystical revelation. Instead, the farmer yelped. "It stings?" "Only when I poke it." Elias sighed and straightened. This was the 7th inexplicable malady this week. First the singing arm, then the self-prophesying rashes, now bioluminescent peasants. At this rate, he half expected someone to sprout wings and declare themselves the new town magistrate. He reached into his satchel for his notebook, a battered, stained thing filled with observations, sketches, and increasingly deranged margin notes. Flipping to a fresh page, he scrawled, "Patient exhibits dermal luminescence. Causa unknown. Possibly divine punishment? On. Yip scratched his glowing neck. "So, what's the verdict, Doc? Am I dying?" Elias hesitated. The truth was, he had no earthly idea. Medicine, as it turned out, was less a science, and more a series of increasingly desperate guesses. He had once treated a man's gangrene by strapping a live trout to it. It hadn't worked, but the man had been too distracted by the fish flapping to notice the pain. "You're not dying," Elias said, with more confidence than he felt. "Probably." Yip did not look reassured. The truth was, Elias had stopped believing in cures somewhere around his 30th corpse. These days, his job was less about healing and more about making the dying slightly less miserable while trying not to join them. He handed Jeb a vial of something murky. "Drink this. It might turn you back to normal, or it might make you flammable. Report back either way." Jeb eyed the vial warily, but pocketed it. "You're a real professional, you know that." "I try." Outside the sick house, the village carried on in its usual state of controlled chaos. A group of children played plague tag, wherein the infected child lurched after the others, moaning dramatically. The blacksmith's singing arm had taken up a new tune, something jaunty and entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. Over by the well, Pindle was attempting to sell glow-in-the-dark tonics, no doubt inspired by Jeb's condition. Elias trudged toward his cottage, his boots kicking up little clouds of dust. He needed a drink. Or 12. His lodgings were as sparse as ever. A bed, a desk, and a shelf sagging under the weight of unread medical texts. A single candle guttered on the windowsill, casting long shadows that danced like the fever-maddened villagers. He shrugged off his coat, letting it slump to the floor in a leathery heap, and sank into the chair. The mask came off next, revealing a face that had long since forgotten what sunlight felt like. He rubbed his eyes, his fingers tracing the permanent indentations the mask left on his nose and cheeks. Why am I still doing this? The question came more often these days. It wasn't as if he were making a difference. The plague didn't care about his tonics or his lancets. It would take whom it pleased, leave whom it didn't, and laugh at the rest. He poured himself a generous measure of something that might have been brandy or possibly paint thinner. It burned going down, which was all that mattered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like a patient begging to be let in. Somewhere in the distance, the quarantine bell tolled, another house marked for death. Elias stared into his cup. He should feel something, shouldn't he? Anger, grief, resignation? Instead, there was just emptiness, a hollow where his outrage used to be. A knock at the door startled him. Sister Marguerite stood on the threshold, her wimple slightly singed at the edges. "We have a problem." Elias didn't move. Define problem. "The mayor's back." "Ah. And he's brought friends." Elias sighed and reached for his mask. "Are they glowing?" "No." "Singing?" "No." "Then what's the issue?" Marguerite hesitated. "They're on fire." Elias closed his eyes. "Of course they are." He stood, fastened the mask, and followed her out into the night. Somewhere above, a crow circled, its laughter lost in the wind. And the plague went on. Chapter 8. The Mysterious Stranger. The mayor's flaming entourage had been dealt with, mostly by throwing buckets of water at them until they stopped smoldering, and Elias had retreated to the makeshift tavern near the edge of the village. The place was barely more than a shack with delusions of grandeur, but it served ale that was only mildly poisonous, which in Varen's Hollow counted as high praise. He slumped onto a stool that groaned under his weight, his mask pushed up just enough to allow for drinking. The barkeep, a grizzled man with one milky eye and a perpetual scowl, slid a tankard toward him without a word. Elias took a long, fortifying swig. It tasted like despair and fermented turnips. He was halfway through contemplating the merits of simply setting himself on fire to escape this nightmare when a shadow fell across the table. "You look like a man in need of answers." The voice was smooth, almost musical, with an undercurrent of something Elias couldn't quite place. Amusement? Malice? Indigestion? He looked up. The stranger was tall, wrapped in a cloak so black it seemed to drink in the light around it. His face was obscured by a deep hood, save for the glint of eyes that might have been green or possibly gold, depending on how the flickering candlelight hit them. His fingers, long, pale, and oddly graceful, drummed against the tabletop in a rhythm that matched the distant tolling of the quarantine bell. Elias set his tankard down. And you look like a man who enjoys stating the obvious. The stranger chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply know what others do not. Wonderful. Another mystic. Elias rubbed his temples. If you're here to sell me a charm made of toenails and bad decisions, save your breath. I've met Pindle. The stranger's head tilted slightly. Ah, the apothecary with the exploding toads. A man of questionable methods. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about him. The stranger slid into the seat opposite Elias. Up close, his cloak smelled faintly of old books and something metallic like blood or rust. I am not here to sell you anything, doctor, only to offer advice. Elias snorted. Advice is cheap, especially here. Then let mine be freely given. The stranger leaned forward, and for a moment Elias could have sworn the shadows in the room leaned with him. You search for a cure where there is none. You fight a battle already lost. The plague does not spread by miasma, or humors, or bad luck. It spreads because people believe in it. Elias blinked. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Is it? The stranger's fingers stilled. Tell me, doctor, have you ever seen a healthy man fall ill simply because he was told he would? Elias opened his mouth to argue, then hesitated. He had, in fact. Just last week, a perfectly robust farmer had collapsed within minutes of being informed he'd been exposed. The stranger smiled, though Elias couldn't see his mouth. The mind is a powerful thing, more powerful than your lancets and tonics. Elias scowled. So what? I should just tell everyone they're fine and hope for the best. No, you should ask yourself why you're still here. The question hit like a punch to the gut. Elias stiffened. Someone has to tend the sick. Do they? The stranger's voice dropped to a whisper. Or is that just what you tell yourself to avoid admitting you're as trapped as they are? The tavern seemed to grow colder. Elias' fingers tightened around his tankard. Who are you? A concerned observer. The stranger stood, his cloak swirling around him like ink in water. Think on what I've said, doctor, or don't. It makes little difference to me. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and you might want to check on the baker's daughter. I believe her toes have started reciting poetry. And with that he was gone, melting into the shadows as though he'd never been there at all. Elias sat frozen for a long moment. Then, with a muttered curse, he slammed back the rest of his ale, dropped a coin on the table, and stumbled out into the night. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting flowers. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its voice sharp with laughter. Elias quickened his pace. The stranger's words gnawed at him, digging under his skin like burrs. It was nonsense, of course. The plague was real. The deaths were real. Verante. He rounded the corner to the sick house and stopped dead. The baker's daughter sat on the steps, her bare feet stretched out before her. And as Elias watched, her toes, each one adorned with a tiny, crudely drawn face, began to sing. Not poetry, then. A drinking song. Elias closed his eyes. Somewhere in the darkness he could have sworn he heard laughter. And the plague went on. Chapter 9. The Rat King's Court. The baker's daughter's singing toes had been the final straw. After administering a strong sedative, to himself, not the toes, Elias decided his only recourse was to get catastrophically drunk. Unfortunately, the village's alcohol supply had dwindled to something resembling fermented dishwater, which left him wandering the outskirts of town in a haze of exhaustion and existential dread. That was how he found the rats. At first, he thought it was a trick of the moonlight, shadows pooling strangely in the abandoned granary near the old mill. But as he drew closer, the shadows resolved into shapes. Dozens of them. Hundreds. A seething, chittering mass of rodents gathered in unnaturally perfect concentric circles around a raised platform of broken crates. And on that platform sat the largest rat Elias had ever seen. It was the size of a small dog, its fur patchy and streaked with gray, one milky eye glaring at nothing. A crude crown of bent nails and chicken bones sat askew on its head. As Elias watched, frozen in horrified fascination, the creature rose on its hind legs and spread its front paws in a gesture that could only be described as regal. A hush fell over the rodent assembly. "Subjects," the rat declared in a voice like rustling parchment, "we gather tonight to discuss matters of grave import." Elias blinked. Then he pinched himself. Then he blinked again. The rat was still there. Still talking. "The humans grow complacent," the Rat King continued, pacing the platform with surprising dignity for something that had probably been eating glue earlier. "Their sick houses overflow. Their apothecaries peddle nonsense. This is our moment." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. One particularly enthusiastic young rat squeaked, "Death to the two legs." The Rat King nodded sagely. "Indeed, but subtlety is key. We shall nibble their grain stores in the night, piss in their flour, chew through the ropes of their church bells so they toll at ungodly hours." Elias, despite his better judgment, found himself stepping forward. "That's your grand plan? Mild inconveniences?" The sea of rats turned as one. Hundreds of beady eyes fixed on him. The Rat King's whiskers twitched. "Ah," it said. "The plague man." Elias gestured vaguely at the assembled rodents. "What in the nine hells is this?" The Rat King drew itself up to its full, unimpressive height. "This mortal is my court, and you are interrupting." One of the bolder rats scampered up to sniff Elias's boot. "Can we eat him?" "Not yet," the Rat King said. Elias rubbed his temples. "Right, of course, talking rats. Why wouldn't there be talking rats?" He was definitely hallucinating. It had to be the bad ale, or the plague, or possibly both. The Rat King licked its paw and smoothed down a tuft of fur behind its ear. "You doubt our existence? How very human of you." A chorus of squeaky laughter rose from the assembly. Elias sighed. "Fine. Let's say you're real. What do you want?" The Rat King's tail flicked. "The same as any monarch. Territory, power. The occasional wheel of particularly fine cheese." It leaned forward. "But mostly, we want you to stop poisoning our kin with your so-called cures." Elias blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your rat catchers, your traps, your pastries laced with arsenic." The Rat King's voice dripped with disdain. "Barbaric daughters. I don't, that's not." Elias sputtered. "Your rats, you spread disease." The Rat King gasped, clutching its chest as though mortally wounded. "Slander. We are but humble scavengers cleaning up humanity's messes. If anything, you should be thanking us." One of the courtiers piped up. "We ate 3 plague corpses just last week." The Rat King shot the underling a glare. "Not helping, Gerald." Elias stared. "You're joking." "About Gerald? Never. He's insufferable." "No, up." Elias waved a hand. "All of this." The Rat King sighed. "Humans, so quick to dismiss what they cannot comprehend." It gestured grandly. "Very well. Allow me to demonstrate our value." It snapped its fingers, a remarkable feat for a creature without opposable thumbs, and 2 burly rats dragged forward a struggling field mouse wearing a tiny vest. "Behold," the Rat King intoned, "the true culprit behind your so-called plague." The mouse squeaked indignantly. Elias stared. "That's a mouse. An agent of the Mouse King." The Rat King puffed out its chest. "Our eternal rivals. They've been slipping poison into your grain stores for months." The mouse shook its tiny fist. "Lease, we only poisoned the grain that was already moldy." Elias sat down heavily on a nearby crate. "I need a drink." The Rat King nodded sympathetically. "Join the club." For a long moment, the only sound was the skittering of tiny feet and the distant tolling of the still intact church bell. Elias's head pounded. This couldn't be real. And yet, he looked at the Rat King. "If I promise to tell the villagers to lay off the rat poison, will you help me stop the plague?" The Rat King stroked its chin. "What's in it for us? Not being burned alive when the villagers inevitably blame someone for their suffering?" The rats murmured amongst themselves. The Rat King considered this. "Throw in weekly cheese offerings and you have a deal." Elias groaned. "Fine, cheese, kitkelnaoni piltikai, hameterdigande, cheese kort settlendassaw." The Rat King clapped its paws. "Excellent. Then we shall—" It paused, sniffing the air. "Do you smell smoke?" Elias did smell smoke. A moment later, the door of the granary burst open, revealing Pindle holding a torch in one hand and a bubbling vial in the other. "Fear not, citizens. I shall purge this nest of vermin with my patented rodent-repellent elixir." The rats screamed. The Mouse King's agent fainted. Elias barely had time to shout, "Don't!" before Pindle hurled the vial into the granary. What happened next was difficult to describe, but it involved a small explosion, several suddenly airborne rats, and Pindle's beard catching fire. When the smoke cleared, Elias found himself lying in the dirt, staring at the stars. The Rat King, now crownless but otherwise unharmed, sat on his chest. "I hate your apothecary," it said. Elias coughed. "Join the club." Somewhere in the distance a crow laughed, and the plague inexplicably went on. Chapter 10. The Midnight Diagnosis. The explosion had left Elias with a ringing in his ears, a newfound skepticism about rodent monarchy, and a lingering smell of burnt hair that no amount of scrubbing seemed to remove. But as he stood in the sick house at midnight, lantern in hand, staring at the rows of afflicted villagers, he realized something far more disturbing. None of them appeared particularly interested in getting better. Old Thomas lounged on his cot, picking at a scab that had begun to form letters spelling "Habandon Hope Go." "Don't fuss, doctor," he said, waving away Elias's lancet. "I've grown rather fond of my personal little oracle here." Nearby, the baker's daughter was teaching her singing toes a new harmony, while the blacksmith's wife had tied little ribbons around her hymn-singing arm to make it presentable for Sunday service. Even the mayor, still faintly green from his pudding mishap, had propped himself up in bed to hold court, happily accepting gifts from villagers who now considered his condition a mark of divine favor. Elias gripped his medical bag until the leather creaked. "You do realize you're all still sick?" Lady Winthrop, who had taken to wearing her vomit-stained gown like a badge of honor, patted his arm. "Oh, doctor, you worry too much. A little plague never hurt anyone." "Actually. Besides," she continued, "I haven't had this much attention since my wedding day. Did you know 3 men have proposed to me this week?" 3. And one was already married. Elias pinched the bridge of his nose beneath the mask. "You're contagious." She winked. "So they tell me." He moved down the line, his diagnostic efforts meeting similar resistance at every turn. A farmer refused treatment for his glowing skin because it helped him find the privy at night. A tanner's apprentice had started charging admission for people to watch his boils erupt in artistic patterns. Even Sister Marguerite seemed to have given up, sitting in the corner and knitting what appeared to be a very long, very uneven burial shroud. The final straw came when he found Pindle holding court in the apothecary corner, demonstrating his latest invention, a plague tonic made from fermented mushrooms, and what smelled suspiciously like turpentine. A line of villagers waited eagerly with their cups. Elias stormed over and knocked the bottle from Pindle's hands. It shattered on the floor, releasing a vapor that made nearby candles flare green. "You're killing them," Elias snapped. Pindle looked genuinely hurt. "Nonsense. My elixirs have never killed anyone faster than the plague itself would have. That's not the endorsement you think it is." A cough from behind made them both turn. The stranger in the black cloak stood in the doorway, his hood shadowing his face as usual. "Trouble in paradise?" Elias threw up his hands. "They don't want to be cured." The stranger chuckled. "Course they don't. Sick people get attention, sympathy, purpose." He stepped forward, his cloak whispering across the floor. "Tell me, doctor, what would these good folk have to go back to? Back-breaking labor, empty cupboards, the slow, grinding misery of ordinary life." Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. The villagers were watching him now, their expressions a mix of defiance and something uncomfortably like hope. Not hope for recovery, hope that he would leave them be. The Rat King's words came back to him. "They believe in it. Edanianis, desires pamphone. Is a public cabbage." The stranger leaned close, his breath oddly cold against Elias's ear. "The plague didn't make them this way, doctor. It simply showed them what they already were." A silence fell. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, once, twice. Then, as if on cue, the baker's daughter's toes launched into a spirited rendition of Gaiety ballad of the doomed lover, the blacksmith's arm providing accompaniment. Elias looked around at his patients. No, his fellow villagers. Really looked. Saw the way old Thomas carefully preserved his prophetic scab. How the farmer's children played happily by the light of his glowing skin. Even Pindle, for all his idiocy, had found a calling. He sighed and set down his bag. "Fine. But if anyone develops a fourth arm, I'm lancing it." The villagers cheered. Someone passed around a bottle of something that made the room spin gently. And as the midnight hour stretched on, Elias found himself sitting in the corner, mask hanging loose, listening to the singing limbs and watching the glow-in-the-dark farmer dance with the mayor's wife, while Pindle attempted to teach a rat to waltz. The stranger was gone when he looked up, but the crow remained watching from the windowsill with what might have been approval, or indigestion. And the plague, in its own peculiar way, went on. Chapter 11. The Barrel of Leeches. Elias had accepted many things about his profession over the years. The smell, the blood, the occasional patient who mistook him for death himself and tried to barter for more time. But there was one aspect of medieval medicine he had never fully reconciled himself to: the leeches. The morning had begun with Sister Marguerite dragging a suspiciously sloshing barrel into the sick house, her wimple askew and her expression grimly triumphant. "Look what Brother Anselm found in the monastery cellar," she announced, thumping the side of the barrel with a sound like a wet sack of coins. A fresh batch. Elias peered into the dark water. Dozens of black, slug-like bodies undulated just beneath the surface, their tiny mouths already puckering in anticipation. "Define fresh." Marguerite ignored him and began ladling the creatures into a bowl with the enthusiasm of a chef preparing soup. "We'll start with the mayor. His humors are clearly out of balance." "His humors aren't out of balance," Elias said. "He's an idiot who ate experimental pudding." Marguerite paused, ladle dripping. "Exactly. The foolishness has congested his liver. It's basic Galenic theory." Elias opened his mouth to argue, then remembered the time he'd tried to explain germ theory to Pindle and nearly been burned as a witch. He sighed. "Fine, but only 3. Marguerite grinned and scooped out 6. The mayor, to his credit, took the leech application with surprising dignity, Or perhaps it was just the lingering effects of the green elixir. He lay back on his cot and closed his eyes as Marguerite positioned the creatures along his arms. "Tell me, doctor," he murmured, "do you think they'll grant me wisdom?" Elias watched as the first leech latched on with gusto. "No, but they might make you slightly lighter." The treatment progressed, or rather devolved, from there. The baker's daughter insisted the leeches would help her toes sing higher notes. The blacksmith demanded they be applied directly to his singing arm to balance the humors musically. Even old Tomas allowed a few on his prophetic scab, claiming they might clarify the message. By midday, the sick house had taken on the atmosphere of a particularly morbid garden party. Patients compared their leeches like fine wines. "Mine has a robust grip." "Ah, but mine has artistic flair." Pindle wandered through offering leeches à la mode, which appeared to be regular leeches dipped in vinegar, while Sister Marguerite kept careful tally of which leech had drained whom, and for how long. Elias retreated to a quiet corner, where he found the Rat King observing the proceedings from atop a cupboard. "You're looking well," he muttered. The Rat King groomed its whiskers. "I avoid your kind's idea of medicine. The last time one of those things latched onto Gerald, he started composing bad poetry." As if on cue, one of the leeches detached itself from the blacksmith's arm and launched into a surprisingly eloquent soliloquy about the futility of existence before plopping back into the bowl with a wet plop. Elias stared. "Did that just—" "Don't ask," the Rat King advised. The chaos reached its peak when Pindle, in a fit of inspiration, decided to test his latest theory, that leeches worked better when drunk. Before Elias could stop him, the apothecary had dunked a handful of the creatures into his fortified elixir. The results were immediate and catastrophic. The inebriated leeches became belligerent. One latched onto Pindle's nose and refused to let go. Another launched itself at Sister Marguerite's wimple with startling accuracy. A particularly ambitious specimen began scaling the wall, pausing only to deliver what sounded like insults in a language no one recognized. Elias watched, frozen in horrified fascination, as the blacksmith's singing arm began a rousing rendition of "Gott the Drunken Sailor" to accompany the madness. It was the Rat King who finally broke the spell. "You humans," it sighed, "are the only creatures stupid enough to get parasites drunk." Then it vanished into the shadows, its tail flicking in disdain. By nightfall, order had been restored, mostly. The leeches had been rounded up and returned to their barrel, though several had to be pried off the ceiling. The patients, exhausted but oddly cheerful, lay abed comparing leech marks like battle scars. Even Pindle seemed satisfied, despite now having a nose the size and color of a ripe plum. Elias sat on the steps of the sick house, his mask in his hands, staring at the moon. Behind him, the faint sounds of the baker's daughter's toes, humming a lullaby, drifted through the door. A shadow fell across him. The stranger in the black cloak stood at the bottom of the steps, his face hidden as always. "You look troubled, Doctor." Elias didn't look up. "I'm beginning to think I don't understand medicine at all." The stranger chuckled. "Medicine is a story people tell themselves to feel better. Sometimes the story works, sometimes it doesn't." He tilted his head. "The leeches didn't kill anyone today. That's a victory, isn't it?" Elias considered this. "I suppose." The stranger turned to go, then paused. "You might want to check on the apothecary tomorrow. I hear he's planning to test whether leeches can be trained to fetch small objects." Elias groaned. Somewhere overhead, a crow laughed, and the plague in all its absurd glory went on. Chapter 12. The Doctor's Near-Death Experience. Elias knew he was sick the moment he woke with his bones full of lead and his thoughts swimming through molasses. The realization came without panic, just a quiet, resigned certainty that after months of dancing through plague-stricken streets he had finally caught the tune. He barely managed to strap on his mask before collapsing back onto his cot. The leather felt foreign against his fevered skin. the herbs inside suddenly cloying rather than comforting. Through the mask's eye holes he watched the ceiling spin lazily, like a drunkard's vision of the stars. Time became unreliable. Shadows stretched and yawned. At some point, the door creaked open, and Sister Marguerite's face swam into view, her mouth moving soundlessly before she vanished again. The candle on his bedside table burned without consuming itself, its flame frozen mid-dance. Then he arrived. Death looked nothing like the woodcuts in the churches. No scythe, no billowing robes. Just a tired-looking man in a charcoal-gray doublet, sitting on the edge of Elias's cot like an overdue visitor. His fingers, long and pale, drummed a soundless rhythm against his knee. "You're late," Death said. Elias' tongue felt 3 sizes too large. "I don't feel dead." Death arched an eyebrow. "Do you feel alive?" The question hung in the air between them. Somewhere beyond the cottage walls, Elias heard the faint, off-key singing of the baker's daughter's toes. Death sighed and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Let's not waste time with denials. You've got one foot in my domain, and the other in a poultice that smells like despair and onions." He produced a scroll from nowhere and unfurled it with a snap. "Elias Mortimer, plague doctor, 32 years old, notable for—" He squinted at the parchment. "An alarming tolerance for human stupidity, and a liver that deserves its own epic poem." Elias tried to sit up. The room tilted violently. "Is this an audit?" Death rolled up the scroll with a flick of his wrist. "Call it a professional courtesy. Normally I don't do house calls for your sort. Plague doctors usually come to me in bulk. But you've been annoyingly persistent." He leaned in. 6 months, Elias. 6 months breathing miasma, drinking questionable tonics, and arguing with rodents. Most men would have succumbed to despair by now, or common sense. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The candle flame finally sputtered, sending shadows crawling up the walls. "Why am I still here?" Elias heard himself ask. Death smiled, a thin razor-blade curve of lips. "Because they need you." "The villagers?" Elias coughed, the sound wet and ugly. "They don't want to be cured. They've made pets of their symptoms." "Exactly." Death stood, his form suddenly towering, the ceiling bending around him like parchment held too close to a flame. "You think this is about medicine? About cures?" His voice dropped to a whisper that crawled inside Elias's skull. "You're the straight man in a cosmic farce. The one sane voice in a choir of madness. Without you, who would they perform for?" The cottage walls breathed in and out. The candle guttered. Death's hand, cold as a grave at midnight, brushed Elias's forehead. "Rest, doctor. The plague isn't done with you yet." When Elias woke 3 days later, the first thing he saw was a leech dangling from the bedpost like a forgotten stocking. The second was Sister Marguerite snoring in the corner, a half-knitted sock slumped in her lap. He sat up slowly. His body ached, but the leaden weight was gone. On the table beside him sat a cup of water, a crust of bread, and, inexplicably, a single black chess piece. The king. Elias reached for it, turning the cold wood between his fingers. Outside, the village bell tolled, and somewhere in the distance, a crow laughed. And the plague, ever the gracious host, went on. Chapter 13. The Villagers' Revolt. Elias knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the village square and found the stocks freshly oiled. This in itself was not unusual. Justice in Verine's Hollow had always been swift and questionable, but the carving on the wooden frame gave him pause. Someone had taken the time to etch a crude but unmistakable likeness of a plague doctor's mask into the weathered oak. The first stone hit his shoulder as he passed the baker's shop. "Traitor!" screeched Goodwife Harlow from her doorway, already winding up for another throw. Elias ducked the second projectile, a hardened lump of dough that might have been bread in a previous life. and turned just in time to see the mob coalescing from the morning mist. There was the blacksmith, his singing arm now bound in a sling that did nothing to muffle its continued hymnal mutterings. There was old Thomas, his prophetic scab freshly polished and glistening in the dawnlight. Even the baker's daughter had hobbled into view, her toes whispering treasonous limericks against the cobblestones. Mayor Winthrop pushed to the front, his complexion now an interesting shade of yellow-green that complemented his emerald doublet. "We've had enough of your so-called cures, Mortimer." Elias adjusted his mask, his proper mask, thank God, and tried to remember if he'd accidentally poisoned anyone recently. "What exactly am I being accused of?" A murmur ran through the crowd. The blacksmith's arm chose that moment to belt out a particularly dramatic chord. "You've been holding out on us," shouted the miller's wife. "Withholding the good medicines," added the cooper. "Making secret deals with the Rat King," accused Pindle, who appeared to be missing an eyebrow. Elias stared. "You're angry because I haven't been poisoning you enough?" The mayor drew himself up with all the dignity a man covered in self-inflicted leech marks could muster. "We know about your arrangement with the rodents, the midnight cheese deliveries, the suspicious lack of rat-related deaths. Unlike the human ones," muttered Sister Marguerite from the back, earning herself a glare. A rock whistled past Elias's ear. Another struck his satchel, sending glass vials clinking ominously. The crowd's mutterings grew louder, angrier, their various ailments forgotten in the rush of collective outrage. The baker's daughter's toes began chanting what sounded like a drinking song, about lynching. It was the Rat King who saved him, though not out of any sense of loyalty. The creature appeared on the roof of the smithy, its makeshift crown slightly askew, and let out a piercing whistle that cut through the mob's fury. "Fools," it squeaked. "You think the doctor is your enemy?" It gestured dramatically with a paw. "Look among yourselves." The villagers hesitated. Then, slowly, they turned. Old Thomas was the first to notice. "My scab," he cried. It's changed." The blacksmith gasped. "My arm, it's singing. A different tune." Panic rippled through the crowd as each villager discovered their symptoms had altered overnight. The baker's daughter's toes were now reciting pious scripture. The glowing farmer's skin had shifted from blue to an alarming fuchsia. Even the mayor's greenish tint had acquired a polka dot pattern. Pindle pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "You did this. Some sort of revenge." Elias, who had been seriously considering the stocks as a preferable alternative to this conversation, froze as realization dawned. He turned slowly to look at the Rat King. The rodent shrugged. "The Mouse King may have overstated his neutrality in our conflict." Chaos erupted. The villagers turned on each other, accusations flying faster than the occasional poorly aimed vegetable. The blacksmith attempted to strangle his own arm. Old Thomas tried to sell tickets to view his miraculously transformed scab. Elias took the opportunity to back away, only to find the stranger in black waiting at the edge of the square. "Interesting development," the stranger murmured. Elias eyed him. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this?" The stranger's hood shifted slightly. Perhaps a shrug, perhaps a shake of the head. "Mice are such unpredictable creatures." He turned to leave, then paused. "The stalks would have suited you, by the way. Bring out the angles of your jaw." And with that, he was gone, leaving Elias alone in a village that had, once again, found new and creative ways to avoid blaming the actual plague for their problems. Somewhere above it all, a crow laughed. And the plague, ever the opportunist, went on. Chapter 14. The Escape Through the Cabbage Field. Elias had never considered himself a particularly athletic man. Plague doctoring generally required more stamina than speed, more fortitude than agility. But as the first pitchfork came whistling past his ear, he discovered reserves of athleticism he hadn't known he possessed. The villagers' anger had turned from abstract accusations to immediate violence with startling speed. One moment they were arguing among themselves about whose mutated symptoms were most holy. The next they had apparently decided that stabbing the doctor would solve everything. He dove between two cottages as another fork embedded itself in the wall where his head had been. The alleyway stank of damp and cat urine, but at least it was momentarily pitchfork-free. "Traitor!" screamed Goodwife Harlow from somewhere behind him. "You're in league with the vegetable demons." Elias didn't pause to ask what vegetable demons were, or why he might be allied with them. He kept running, his medical bag thumping against his hip, his mask threatening to slip with every frantic step. The shouts grew closer. Something heavy and possibly rotten whizzed past his shoulder. Then he saw it, Farmer Brindle's cabbage field stretching out before him, the rows of leafy heads bobbing gently in the breeze like a sea of verdant salvation. Without thinking, he plunged in. The cabbages were larger than he remembered, their leaves forming a dense canopy that slapped at his face as he ran. The earth beneath was soft and treacherously uneven, each step threatening to turn an ankle. Behind him, the crashing of multiple pursuers through vegetable matter grew louder. "Get the rat-loving bastard!" roared the blacksmith, his singing arm apparently providing motivational cadence. Elias risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The entire village seemed to have joined the chase, armed with everything from hayforks to rolling pins. Pendle brought up the rear, waving what appeared to be a jar of leeches and shouting something about justice. A cabbage leaf slapped him full in the face, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled, crashed through several more plants, and emerged into a small clearing just in time to collide with the Rat King. The rodent monarch was perched on an overturned bucket, surveying the chaos with what looked like professional interest. "Ah," it said as Elias struggled to regain his balance. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "You," Elias gasped, pointing an accusatory finger. "This is your fault." The Rat King adjusted its crown. "Technically, it's the Mouse King's fault, but I take your point." It hopped nimbly onto Elias's shoulder as another projectile, this one suspiciously cheese-shaped, arced overhead. "I suggest we continue this discussion elsewhere." They burst from the far side of the cabbage field, just as the first villagers reached the clearing. The pasture beyond sloped down to the river, where a single leaky rowboat bobbed at its mooring. Elias didn't hesitate. The boat protested as he tumbled into it but held together. The Rat King took up position at the prow like some fiery figurehead as Elias fumbled with the oars. Across the field, the villagers were regrouping, their shouts growing louder as they spotted their quarry. "Interesting," mused the Rat King as Elias pulled frantically at the oars. "I didn't realize cabbages could be used as projectile weapons. One learned something new every day." Elias didn't answer. His arms burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, and somewhere beneath the terror, a small part of him marveled at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, fleeing a mob of his own patients, accompanied by a talking rat, while the remains of what might have been Farmer Brindle's prize-winning cabbage clung to his boots. The current caught them just as the first villagers reached the riverbank. Their curses followed the boat downstream, growing fainter with each turn of the river. The Rat King groomed its whiskers. "So, where to now, Doctor?" Elias slumped against the stern, letting the oars rest. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Ahead, the river wound through unfamiliar countryside, the water reflecting the afternoon sun like molten gold. "Anywhere," he said at last, "that doesn't have cabbages." Somewhere high above, a crow circled, its shadow flitting across the water like a dark omen. And the plague, ever the patient hunter, waited. Chapter 15. The Return of the Mask. The boat finally came to rest in a tangle of reeds, its prow sinking into the mud with a tired sigh. Elias sat motionless for a long moment, listening to the water lap against the hull, and the distant shouts of villagers who had apparently decided cabbages could, in fact, be thrown across a river. The Rat King had vanished somewhere during the journey, leaving behind only a faint smell of damp fur and what might have been a royal decree scratched into the bench. Night was falling by the time Elias mustered the energy to move. His legs protested as he climbed from the boat, his boots sinking into the soft bank. The landscape was unfamiliar, marshy and thick with willows that trailed their branches in the dark water like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a lone frog croaked its disapproval of the entire situation. Elias patted his bag absently, checking for supplies. His fingers brushed something hard and smooth. Frowning, he drew it out into the fading light. The mask. His proper mask. The one he'd left behind what felt like a lifetime ago. The leather was cool to the touch, the glass eyes reflecting the first stars of evening. He turned it over in his hands, running his thumb along the beak's curve. How had it gotten here? He distinctly remembered leaving it on his dresser that morning. A twig snapped behind him. Elias spun, the mask clutched to his chest like a shield. The stranger in black stood at the edge of the trees, his cloak blending seamlessly with the gathering dark. Looking for this? The stranger held up a second mask, identical in every way save for a single crack running through the left eye. Elias stared between the two masks, then at the stranger. What sort of game is this? The stranger chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. No game, Doctor, merely returning what was lost. He stepped closer, the marsh grass whispering beneath his boots. Though I wonder, does it still fit? Elias raised the mask to his face. The familiar weight settled against his skin, the herbs inside releasing their sharp, comforting scent. Through the eye holes, the world seemed sharper, clearer, the shadows more defined, the stranger's face suddenly unsettlingly visible beneath the hood. He stumbled back, nearly losing his footing in the mud. You. The stranger smiled, a slow, knowing curve of lips that held too many teeth. Me. The night seemed to hold its breath. The frog had gone silent. Even the wind stilled in the trees. Then, from somewhere far away, came the sound of a village bell tolling. Not the steady rhythm of the hour, but the frantic pealing of alarm. The stranger's smile widened. Ah, it begins. Elias turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. Across the water, beyond the trees, a faint orange glow had appeared on the horizon. Not the warm light of hearth fires, but the hungry flicker of something far less welcoming. The mask felt suddenly heavier on his face. The stranger leaned in, his breath cold against Elias's ear. Best hurry, Doctor, your patients are waiting. And with that, he was gone, leaving only the cracked mask lying in the grass, its empty eyes staring up at the first stars. Elias took a deep breath. Then another. The familiar weight of the mask grounded him, even as the distant firelight promised chaos. Somewhere behind him, a crow laughed, and the plague, ever the patient hunter, bared its teeth. Chapter 16. The Dawn of Realization. The fire had burned itself out by dawn. Elias stood at the edge of the village, his mask dangling from limp fingers, watching thin tendrils of smoke curl into the pale morning sky. The damage was less than he'd feared, mostly storehouses and the abandoned mill, but the air still carried the sharp tang of charred wood and failed ambitions. The villagers moved through the wreckage like ghosts, their usual clamor reduced to hushed murmurs. No one had died. No one had even been hurt, unless you counted Pindle's singed beard, which the apothecary was currently attempting to style into something fashionable. Elias sat heavily on a scorched tree stump, the dew soaking through his trousers. His bones ached with something deeper than exhaustion. He stared at the mask in his hands, the smooth leather, the hollow eyes, and wondered when it had stopped feeling like armor and started feeling like a weight. The Rat King emerged from the ashes of the grain store, its fur gray with soot. It climbed onto the stump beside Elias and began meticulously cleaning its whiskers. Your villagers, it said between licks, have the collective intelligence of a concussed pigeon. Elias didn't argue. He watched as Sister Marguerite attempted to organize a bucket line with a group of children who seemed more interested in poking at the embers. The rodent finished its grooming and studied Elias with its good eye. "You're wondering if any of it mattered." Elias flexed his fingers around the mask. "Did it?" The Rat King considered this. "Define mattered. The medicines, the leeches, the leeches." He waved a hand at the smoking ruins. "All of it." A breeze stirred the ashes at their feet, sending up a tiny whirlwind of gray. Somewhere nearby, the baker's daughter's toes were humming a mournful tune. The Rat King twitched its tail. "You kept them entertained. Gave them something to blame besides each other. That's more than most manage." Elias frowned. "I thought I was supposed to cure them." The rodent snorted. "Cure them of what? Being human?" It shook its head. "Even we rats know better than that." Sunlight broke over the rooftops, painting the smoke gold. The villagers had begun to regroup, their voices rising in familiar squabbles. Already, the shock was fading, replaced by the usual petty grievances and absurdities. Elias stood, slipping the mask back over his face. The familiar scent of herbs filled his nose, the weight settling comfortably against his cheeks. The Rat King nodded approvingly. "Better. Now what?" Elias surveyed his village, the burned buildings, the squabbling survivors, the endless, ridiculous struggle of it all. Somewhere in the crowd, the blacksmith's arm began a rousing drinking song. He adjusted his hat. "Now we rebuild." The rodent sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." Together they walked toward the village, the rising sun at their backs. And the plague, ever the patient teacher, waited for its next lesson. Chapter 17. The Last Laugh. The village square had become a stage, and Elias found himself the unwilling star of the performance. Then the good doctor ran, bellowed old Thomas, clutching his prophetic scab as if it were a prop, like a hare with its tail on fire. The villagers roared with laughter, their ailments forgotten in the joy of retelling his humiliation. Someone had even constructed a crude puppet with a beak mask that they kept tossing between them like a child's ball. Elias leaned against what remained of the smithy wall, watching the spectacle unfold. The blacksmith's arm had finally stopped singing hymns, and now conducted the merriment with dramatic sweeps. The baker's daughter's toes tapped along in rhythm beneath her skirts. Even Pindle had joined in, embellishing the story with each retelling. By now, Elias was fairly certain he hadn't actually leapt over the mill pond while being chased by enchanted cabbages. "Don't look so glum, Birdman," chuckled the mayor, sloshing ale over the rim of his tankard. "You're our favorite catastrophe." He leaned in close, his breath a toxic mix of alcohol and lingering pudding consequences. "Between you and me, best entertainment we've had since the Harvest Festival pig escaped into the rectory." Sister Marguerite appeared at Elias's side, her wimples slightly less singed than the rest of her. She handed him a cup of something that smelled marginally safer than Pindle's usual concoctions. "They mean it fondly, you know." Elias sipped the drink. It tasted of faintly medicinal herbs, and what might have been honey. "I know." And he did. That was the strange part. Their laughter held no malice, only the giddy relief of survivors who had weathered another storm. The fire had burned away their anger along with the granary, leaving behind this odd camaraderie. The Rat King scampered across his boots, pausing to sniff at a dropped crust of bread. "You humans," it muttered, "have the strangest ways of showing gratitude." As evening fell, the revelry continued. Someone produced a fiddle. The blacksmith's arm began an improbable but enthusiastic jig. Children darted through the crowd, their games now incorporating dramatic reenactments of Elias's flight through the cabbages. Elias found himself smiling beneath his mask. It was absurd. All of it. The plague, the fire, the singing limbs and prophetic scabs. The way these people could stare into the abyss and come away with nothing more than a bawdy song and another round of drinks. The stranger in black appeared at the edge of the square, his hooded face turned toward the celebration. Even from this distance, Elias could see the curve of his lips, that familiar razor-edged smile. For a heartbeat, their gazes met. Then the stranger tipped an imaginary hat and melted into the shadows, leaving only the echo of laughter behind. Elias raised his cup in silent salute, and somewhere above the merriment, a single crow took flight, its wings beating against the twilight sky. The plague had gone, but the story, as always, went on. Chapter 18. The Doctor's Farewell. The morning mist clung to the road like a reluctant lover as Elias fastened his last saddlebag. The village lay quiet behind him, its chimneys just beginning to puff smoke into the pale dawn. His horse, a temperamental bay that had somehow survived both the plague and Pindle's attempts at veterinary medicine, snorted impatiently, its breath curling in the cool air. He had meant to leave without ceremony. No goodbyes, no sentimental farewells. But Farron's Hollow had other ideas. First came the Rat King, scampering down the lane with something clutched in its teeth. It deposited the object at Elias's feet, a tiny crown fashioned from bent spoons and chicken bones. "For your next adventure," it said, then vanished into the hedgerow before he could refuse. Then the villagers appeared, bleary-eyed but determined. The blacksmith's arm waved goodbye in perfect time to a waltz only it could hear. Old Thomas presented Elias with a jar containing his prophetic scab, now preserved in vinegar. "For luck," he wheezed. The baker's daughter curtsied, her toes whispering a surprisingly heartfelt farewell beneath her petticoats. Even Pindle had dragged himself from bed, bearing a suspiciously bubbling flask tied with a ribbon. "For emergencies," he said, then added, "preferably someone else's." Mayor Winthrop, still faintly polka-dotted but otherwise recovered, stepped forward. "You know," he said, scratching his chin, "if you ever forget your mask again." Elias held up a hand. "I won't." The mayor grinned, revealing several new gaps in his teeth, courtesy of the pudding incident. "That's what you said last time." Sister Marguerite pressed a small wrapped bundle into his hands. "Bread, cheese, and something to remind you of us." He unwrapped it later to find a carefully folded drawing of the village done in clumsy child's hand. The residents depicted with exaggerated symptoms and beaming smiles. As Elias mounted his horse, the stranger in black appeared at the edge of the square, leaning against the remains of the stalks. He didn't speak, only nodded, once before fading into the morning mist like a bad memory. The first rays of sun broke over the hills as Elias turned his horse toward the road. Behind him, the villagers began to disperse, their voices rising in familiar squabbles and laughter. The blacksmith's arm struck up a jaunty tune. Someone, probably Pindle, shouted something about cabbages. Elias adjusted his hat, checked twice that his mask was securely fastened, and nudged his horse forward. Somewhere above, a crow circled once before flying east, and the plague doctor rode on. Unless, of course, he forgot his mask again. "As say, from the university,"